A scream cut through the night air, sharp enough to rattle the windows of the small Los Angeles home. It was August 1985, a summer soaked in fear. The city had been sleeping with the lights on for months, terrified of a faceless predator who slipped through windows and doorways like smoke. Neighbors whispered his nickname with dread. Police officers avoided saying it out loud. Inside the LAPD's makeshift task force center, a detective stared at a map covered with red pins. Another attack had just come in. Same pattern. Same brutality. Same ghost. He was already moving before the call ended. The drive through the Los Angeles streets felt unreal. Sirens echoed off apartment buildings, their red and blue lights slicing through the heat. Officers had grown familiar with this sickening rhythm. Another crime scene. Another family broken. Another night where the killer vanished before anyone could even react. When the detective stepped inside the house, the smell of blood and panic lingered in the air. The victim, a woman in her 40s, had fought hard. Defensive wounds covered her hands. Her front door was locked. Her windows were not. On the dusty windowsill, faint impressions of a sneaker sole caught the beam of a flashlight. Same shoe, an officer muttered quietly. Same damn shoe. The detective knelt beside the print, a Via brand. Size 11.5. A rare model, only a handful sold across the whole region. It was the closest thing they had to a signature, besides the terror that followed him. The killer left no hair, no fingerprints, nothing that could identify him, but he left shoes, and he left fear. The task force room was dim, lit mostly by desk lamps and the constant flicker of overhead projectors. Officers drank cold coffee that tasted like metal. Days blurred into nights. Files piled up, forming crooked towers of horror on every table. Photos of victims lined a bulletin board that stretched from wall to wall. Elderly couples, young women, children, each face another reminder of the urgency tightening around the city like a noose. Reporters were circling the case like vultures. The city council demanded answers. Residents bought new locks, guns, and dogs. Talk radio hosts stoked paranoia. Every shadow became a threat. Every night became a gamble. The killer's unpredictability made him even harder to catch. His attacks shifted from one neighborhood to another, from wealthy suburbs to poor communities, without pattern or mercy. Inside the LAPD command room, tempers flared. Some detectives argued he was a single offender. Others believed they were chasing multiple killers. The chief slammed his hand on the table during one heated argument. "One man," he said. "This is one man, one monster, and we need to find him before this city tears itself apart." The FBI had quietly stepped in. Agents worked in the background, combing through shoe distributor lists, monitoring pawnshop sales, and interviewing potential witnesses with military precision. A federal analyst had created a psychological profile. Male, mid-20s, no stable residence, likely a drifter with a violent childhood. The analyst added one chilling line at the bottom. "He will not stop. He is escalating." Weeks dragged by with no break. Officers collapsed into chairs and slept sitting up. Some cried in their cars before walking into the next scene. Others slammed fists against lockers because they couldn't shake the images from their minds. The killer seemed to sense their frustration. His attacks grew bolder, louder, more brazen. In one case, he forced a victim to swear allegiance to the devil. In another, he left behind a drawn pentagram on a wall. It wasn't just murder anymore, it was theater. Then came the turning point. A teenage boy had seen a suspicious man driving through his neighborhood in the early morning hours. He memorized part of the license plate. Detectives pounced on the lead. The plate fragments traced back to a stolen orange Toyota, registered under the name of a man who had reported it missing weeks earlier. The car was found abandoned in a parking lot in East Los Angeles. Inside, officers opened the door and recoiled. The smell was overwhelming. Blood, sweat, metal, and in the back seat, a smeared print of that same Avia shoe. Tech teams descended on the car. They dusted, scraped, photographed, and swabbed every inch. A single fingerprint lifted from the rearview mirror. Faint, partial, but enough. Enough to run through the database. Enough to give a name to the nightmare that had been haunting the city. Richard Ramirez, a 25-year-old drifter with a long record of theft, drug use, and reported violence. He had been in and out of the justice system for years. He had been stopped before. He had been questioned before. Somehow, he had always slipped away. When the detectives saw his mugshot, silence filled the room. Long hair, hollow eyes, a dead stare that looked like he was already somewhere far from humanity. The lieutenant exhaled slowly. "That's him," he said. "That's our guy." The photo was released to the public. Newspapers printed his face in bold. News anchors repeated his name with urgency. For the first time in months, the city felt a shift. Fear turned into anger. People recognized him. People called in sightings. People watched the streets. Ramirez realized he was no longer a ghost. The entire city was hunting him. On the morning of August 31, 1985, Ramirez stepped off a bus in East Los Angeles without knowing his face was plastered on every front page. He walked into a convenience store and noticed customers staring at him. One man stepped outside and pointed at a newspaper rack. Ramirez saw his own eyes staring back from the headline. He panicked, he ran. But this time, the city wasn't willing to wait for police. Residents chased him through alleys and across busy streets. The crowd grew, shouting for him to stop. A man grabbed a metal pipe. Ramirez stumbled. Another man tackled him. When police finally arrived, the killer was bleeding on the ground, surrounded by people who had decided the nightmare ended now. Officers pulled him up, cuffed his hands, and led him to a patrol car. Ramirez looked dazed, muttering something under his breath. One officer later said he whispered the words, "It's over." The trial became a spectacle. Courtrooms packed with reporters, security tight enough to feel suffocating. Ramirez sat at the defense table, smirking at cameras, drawing pentagrams on his palm, and shouting strange phrases to the judge. He fed on attention. Victims' families watched him with silent fury. Prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece. Shoe prints, ballistics, DNA, witness testimony. It was overwhelming. But inside the government offices, where the case had been built, the relief was complicated. Detectives who had worked until their bodies gave out sat in dim corners, wrestling with exhaustion and the weight of every face they couldn't save. Agents who had sifted through endless files and dead ends tried to return to normal life, but sleep didn't come easily. Even years later, some said they still woke up at night, thinking they were hearing the call of another attack. The jury deliberated for a week. When they returned, the courtroom grew silent. The foreman read the verdicts, guilty, over and over, 13 murders, dozens of other charges. Ramirez barely reacted, staring straight ahead as if already somewhere else. He was sentenced to death. As deputies led him away, a victim's family member whispered, "You can't hurt anyone anymore." He spent the rest of his life in a concrete cell, surrounded by steel bars and the echo of everything he had done. He died in 2013, still on death row, still showing no remorse. But the story didn't settle easily, not for the detectives who spent months chasing a phantom.